Right. Good morning, everyone, colleagues, friends, esteemed guests. Welcome to the Development Reimagined Talk Series put on by the 2021 cohort of the Innovation in Global Development PhD program here at ASU. Before we get started, I would like to extend on behalf of my cohort our thanks to our professor, Dr. Netra Chetri, and head of the IGD program here, ASU's technical team, including Melissa, who is here making sure everything runs smoothly today, and of course, my cohort. My name is Caitlin, and I'm also grateful to Prashamsa, Pauline, Luke, Ricky, Teal, and Marta. Make sure we got everyone in there. Of course, our, and you can see them behind us in gold. Of course, our topic today is invisible infrastructure, which we think is very important and interesting to discuss in terms of innovating global development. Of course, we're talking about two overlapping areas here. Elements of non-physical infrastructure, including social, institutional, and technological networks, and individuals who are made invisible by the uneven way in which infrastructure is developed and deployed in many parts of the world. Of course, some housekeeping before we get started. We would like this talk to be as engaging as possible for our panelists and for everyone in the audience today. So we will be utilizing Zoom's Q&A function as well as the poll function today. Please make sure that you drop any of your questions in that Q&A box that you can launch at the bottom of your Zoom interface. And we will also be launching polls in between each of our panelists' talks. Of course, once you have given your poll answer, you can close that dialog box on your screen. When you do ask a question, please do specify if it's for one panelist or the whole panel. And if you are in person and on Zoom, please remember to mute your mic and your computer. And if you do not have Zoom up and you have a question and you're in person, just grab one of my gold shirted colleagues and we will make sure that your question gets answered. This is the second installment in this talk series. Our first installment featured Dr. Allenby, who took a futurist perspective, exploring some of the ethical dimensions of the future possibilities of infrastructure. Today, we welcome our three panelists, and I will allow Prashamsa to introduce them now.
Namaste, everyone. So joining us today, we have three esteemed panelists from their rich backgrounds, representing a large range of fields, including global innovation, civic technology, and urban geography. We would like to welcome Michelle Reisinger, Jonathan Silver, and Geci Karuri-Sebina. So starting with Michelle. Michelle is an innovation strategist, design thinker, facilitator, and a public speaker who has trained over 1,000 individuals in innovation and design thinking approaches. Her work focuses in creating an enabling environment to catalyze social innovation and has managed an award-winning portfolio of global innovation projects with work featured in many publications, including the book Lean Impact. Michelle holds a master's in international peace and conflict studies from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, and has guest lectured at American University, Thunderbird School of Global Management, and the Design for Social Innovation program in New York City.
Jonathan Silver is an urban geographer with the Urban Institute at the University of Sheffield. His research interests are centered around developing new ideas and vocabularies to comparatively think about cities, politics, ecology, and infrastructure. John is currently undertaking a project on post-colonial urbanisms and comparative theory of infrastructure. He holds a master's from the University of Manchester and a PhD in geography from Durham University, and he has worked on a number of research projects at the London School of Economics and Durham University. So we'll introduce our last panelist, Geci.
Geci is an urban scholar practitioner based in Johannesburg, working at the intersection between people, place, and technological change. She is a visiting associate professor at the University of Witwatersrand School of Governance. She is also associated with the University of Cape Town's African Center for Cities. South African Cities Network and Singularity University's global faculty on the future of cities and governance. Geci holds a bachelor's degree in computer science and sociology, master's degree in urban planning and architecture from UCLA, and a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand. Now that we are done with the introduction, we would like to welcome our first speaker, Reisinger.
Thank you so much, facilitators, and thank you, ASU, for the invitation to be here this morning and for the introduction that you just gave. As has been previously mentioned, my name is Michelle Reisinger, and currently I am the founder and principal consultant at Rising Solutions, which is a small women-owned business based in Washington, DC, and I focus on innovation, strategy, and design thinking for social impact. And I've owned my own business for about a year now. And previous to that, I was the global director of innovation and design thinking at PACT, which is a large international INGO with presence in about 40 countries around the world. And I was the founding member of the innovation team and built out that innovation practice to a global team of 5, running internal incubators, accelerators, hackathons, competitions, and then also running a revenue stream for the organization through innovation consulting. And then previous to my time at PACT, I was more in the international humanitarian space. I worked with the Red Cross overseas for about 7 years, primarily in Iraq and Afghanistan. So when I was given the topic for the presentation today, I hope no one minds, I'm going to present without a PowerPoint and try to keep you entertained for my opening here. But when I was thinking about the topic for today's presentation, particularly as it pertains to social innovation, which is the area in which I work, the 2 words that kept coming back to me were power and resources. And as I thought about the invisible infrastructures in the social innovation space, I could not escape those 2 words. And so I started to unpack power and resources a little bit further. And I ended up landing on 3 major insights around social innovation that I would like to share with you as a part of my opening today that I think really speak to the 2 invisible infrastructures of power and resources that play in the social innovation space within the international development and international humanitarian sector. The first one is around the programmatic constraints and the implementation constraints that we operate under in the international development sector. The second insight is around our approach to social innovation and how power and resources influence our approach to social innovation. And then the third insight I want to leave you with is this really critical insight around the disconnect between who the actual end user is when we're doing social innovation. So on to the first point here around the programmatic issues of power and resources. If anyone on this call has ever worked in a nonprofit or in the US government, I don't need to tell you that we operate in an extremely prescriptive and reactive space. And what that means is we are a predominantly proposal-driven industry where donors release proposals for implementers to bid on. And oftentimes those proposals are so prescriptive that they are telling us exactly what the outcomes are going to be of a program 5 years before the program has even been implemented yet. And as many of you can imagine, that kills organic spaces for innovation. If it's not in the budget, if it's not on the timeline, if it's not a deliverable, I'm sorry, but there's just no time to innovate. And to me, it's even a bit oxymoronic that I'm in an actual role as an innovation strategist, trying to help people innovate in this space, because it seems like it's a no-brainer. Innovation should be done by everyone working in this space, but the reality is there is very little time or resources to actually implement within projects. And so you have somebody like me whose whole job is to take on the innovation piece, because those who are doing the daily work, those who are closest to the problems, they can't innovate because they have to adhere to the log frame and they have to adhere to the deliverables. And it's just the oddest system that those who are closest to the problem, those who are actually trying to solve and implement the problem, are beholden to a very prescriptive program design that may have taken place years before the program was implemented, and don't have the time and space within the project to actually innovate. And I'll give you a very real example of this. My team and I at PACT worked on a proposal in Zimbabwe several years ago, which at the time was a very innovative proposal for PACT. We actually wrote into the design of the proposal numerous mechanisms to try to create intentional time and space for our local grassroots partners to be able to try out new ideas, to receive funding to test new ideas. And at the time, it was a very innovative proposal. It took the donor 2.5 years to get back to us, to tell us that we had won the proposal. And guess what had happened in Zimbabwe in between the submission of the proposal and those 2.5 years? Mugabe died. So we are now implementing this proposal in a completely different government context. And the proposal had been written for a Mugabe-oriented government. And now we're in this brand new space where a lot of things are happening and changes are taking place. And we're being told to implement the same proposal that we had written 2.5 years ago. I mean, really, it's crushing these organic spaces for innovation by adhering to this prescriptive system. So that's point number one. Point number two, right now, there is a lot of mesmerization around private sector approaches to innovation. And as an innovation strategist, I hear a lot of emphasis on using business and markets as a way to innovate in the social sector. Now, don't get me wrong, I am actually a proponent of social innovation and of social enterprise. And I do believe that you can have a double or triple bottom line with a business that also has a social impact. However, I have a hypothesis that on a grand scale of the type of impact that we are trying to see in the social sector, which is lifting millions, if not 1 billion people out of poverty, that markets and social enterprises, we don't have the data yet to say that that is the panacea that the sector needs in order to solve problems. To be honest with you, it makes me a little suspicious that we are turning to market mechanisms as the way to lift people out of poverty. Number one, most of the people we're trying to lift out of the poverty are not actually actively consuming from the types of markets that we're looking at to create social change. And number two, I question whether or not we have any data that business mechanisms and markets can actually have the type of impact against the intractable problems that we're trying to solve globally. So I am suspicious about the invisible infrastructures in an approach that is heavily business driven or heavily market driven or capitalistic, because I'm not sure that we've seen those infrastructures actually serve the world's poorest. Again, at the macro level of which we're trying to see change. I do believe that we can see it at a smaller scale. I'm not sure that it is the solution that the social sector has been waiting for in terms of social innovation. And the third insight I want to leave you with is probably the biggest disconnect that I see in my space in social innovation in the international humanitarian development sector. And that is the end user. So as a design thinker, as somebody who spends their time trying to build innovation solutions, whether they're products or services that are more intuitive and empathetic for the end user, the real disconnect for me is that a lot of the time, the ultimate end user is not the person who is using my solution. It's not their needs and their wants and their agency that I'm accountable to. It's the person who's funding the process of developing the product or the service or the solution. And that to me is the biggest disconnect, the biggest invisible infrastructure in the space that I operate in, because I believe that there is a ultimate preservation of the status quo in a lot of our efforts to work in the social sector. And I'm quoting Adnan Giroradas right now when he talks about we need to be doing less harm and not doing more good. And we need to talk more about bringing justice into our social innovation, justice in the social sector, and not as much generosity, not as much giving, not as much doing more good, but bringing more justice into our solutions, which means that some of us are going to have to reconcile that it's not always going to be a win-win. And that is really the only true way to do social innovation and to bring the lean economies that we are trying to help more onto an equitable footing. So I'm going to conclude with two last thoughts here. The first thought is I do have hope that we can change the invisible infrastructures that I see, because in my mind, these are human-made systems. These are not systems that were ordained from above onto us, in which we are burdened to do good within these systems. Humans designed them, and quite frankly, humans used their own incentives to design them, and we still see remnants of those incentives that go back hundreds of years. And so I think we've made significant progress since then, and we're still operating in a tremendously imperfect system that is going to require humans to make an intentional effort to change them. And the second thought I want to leave you with is, I think that those of us who are trying to innovate in the social sector really need to get comfortable with cognitive dissonance, because there is a lot about what I see in the work that I try to do and in recognizing and calling out these invisible infrastructures that I personally am not comfortable with. And so long as you're going to continue to stay and work in this space, I think you need to constantly be asking how we're going to do this better, how you personally are going to do this better, and how you're going to keep calling out those invisible infrastructures, which is why I was so tremendously honored to be asked to speak on this panel. And I hope I've provided you some food for thought, and I very much look forward to your questions. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists and their insights, and back to you, facilitators.
Michelle, thank you so much. I'm sure I speak on behalf of my whole cohort and anyone in the audience who is a current or future development practitioner that those insights are very exciting to hear about, and I'm sure we will have lots of questions about them in the Q&A. Now, audience members, you should shortly see a poll pop up on your screen. I will ask you to put in your 2 cents now so that we can continue the discussion later. I'll give you a moment to do that as our second speaker prepares, Jonathan Silver.
You ready for me to share the screen? Has everyone answered the questions?
We have, yes, we have a little over half reporting, almost 70%. All right, we will close the poll now and hand it over to Jonathan. Thanks so much.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got some pictures. I'm going to play from that and keep an eye on the time. Give me a shout if I start going on and on. I want to talk a bit about invisible infrastructure from the perspective of urban geography, from the perspective of thinking comparatively across different cities. And I think I've got 3 points to make to follow on from Michelle. One is to trouble the idea of invisibility within and across infrastructure studies. 2 is to think about infrastructure that operates beyond the state and think about the potentials, but also the challenges and difficulties around this form of invisible infrastructure. And 3, to shift the focus somewhat away from innovation to think about the role of power and inequality in delivering infrastructure services for all.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I just wanted to let you know that we can't see your whole presentation. If you will put it in presentation mode so we could see it a bit better.
Okay, let me stop and start again. Application window. Is that better?
We're still seeing the editing mode within PowerPoint. I see you clicking. I'm sorry that it's not. Yeah.
It's all right. It's a Zoom thing. Yeah, I'm not sure what I could do with this.
If you can try to click the button next to the cursor at the below on your, I think on your right hand side.
Okay.
Below. Next to that.
Perhaps I can
To
help.
the right.
So there's three.
And to the left, a little left.
Perhaps I can help. Sometimes with Zoom, if you already have it on presenter mode, it might be showing on another screen. So you might need to unshare. And when you go to share screen, don't go to the PowerPoint program, but go to the presentation that's already open.
Is this better?
No.
No. Okay, I think we'll just carry on with some.
Yeah. It is okay if we see them small. I'd rather see them small than not at all. So please do carry on with that. And thanks for troubleshooting.
They're nice big pictures. So let's see what we can do. How's that?
It's fine.
It is fine like that. Please go on. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. I am a social scientist rather than a technical innovator.
It's okay. It's okay.
I think there's something really interesting in the idea of thinking invisible infrastructure. I was intrigued about the title of the panel discussion and some of the work that you're doing in Arizona. Infrastructure. In the modern Western city, it has been designed to be invisible. It's under our streets, it's in the pipes, it's behind walls. It's a system of systems that makes life viable. And yet simultaneously, this is an infrastructure of the modern city that's always been celebrated through discourses of urban modernity and the network city, a connected metropolis, and universal access. And so even in our cities, you see these, in Western cities, you see these very kind of grand celebrations of infrastructure. So infrastructure is both visible and invisible in our daily lives. And yet in contexts such as Namawongo, an informal settlement in Kampala, that kind of idea of visibility and invisibility plays out in different ways. Where the state and utility companies are absent or only partial, the visibility of infrastructure plays out in different ways. And part of that, I think, is around the idea of a social infrastructure, often of collaboration across urban space, where rather than a standardized system of infrastructure, we see a heterogeneous configuration of people and technology operating in the absence or in the partial absence of this networked modern city. So think about these images, if you can see them. We see a variety of technologies that are quite visible, and yet the invisible infrastructures behind these are quite diverse and different. One of the toilets is run by a young guy, an entrepreneur who used his savings and runs it as a livelihood. Another one is run by a church, is actually really only accessible to church members unless you want to pay more. A third one is the private VIP toilet of the local chairman. So these invisible infrastructures act behind the visible infrastructure in ways in which access and use and livelihoods that are generated out of it might not be so visible, at least to people not from the neighborhood. This slide in Garmashi in Accra is one of the many walks we took across the neighborhood to try and map the constantly changing housing and energy infrastructure of the neighborhood. The neighborhood's poor but networked, and yet it's rich with a life of infrastructure, much of which is invisible and under constant change and transformation. Some of it sanctioned by the utility company, some of it taking place in what might be called clandestine or illegal ways, in which rogue electricians hook up new connections, houses create dual supplies, power meters are navigated around so families don't pay the full costs. Landlords create new kinds of connections that they can charge their tenants. So here we see an innovation from below, and we see technical expertise isn't contained just by the engineer. And this is kind of an invisible infrastructure that is both technical but also social. And I think given the decades of development failure in the global south, we need to think more about how these invisible infrastructures can be harnessed. Because what's clear is in places like Garmashi and in Namawongo, that operating toilets and energy systems creates various forms of popular economy. It creates livelihood opportunities for the youth. It creates kind of collaborative platforms for social organizations or churches to generate new kinds of money. It provides spaces for small scale technical innovation. And this is always happening in a negotiation, and it's often contested. It's not always progressive. And I think this is another point that we need to think more about. Here you can see more kind of incremental infrastructures being built in Garmashi, different kinds of walls, surfaces, runways, drainage systems. They're changing every day, and sometimes they're changing out of need. Other times they become platforms for new kind of opportunities.
Jonathan, thank you so much. These insights are excellent even without your PowerPoint, but our tech guru behind the scenes has said that we could maybe help see the, now we can see. Oh, excellent. Okay, please, Karen.
The slides weren't changing for us,
Okay,
so.
Yes.
I think you need to press on the on the right column.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, now it's changing.
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Great.
let me just,
Great.
oh my God, I'm embarrassed. I'm just gonna slowly go back through those slides. These are the toilets I was describing in Namawongo. These are the walks we were doing in Garmashi with communities documenting the everyday different configurations of the energy network. Here you can see shifting kinds of housing patterns. Here you can see, as Abdul Malik Samomo called, people as infrastructure, resisting an attempt by authorities to demolish self-made housing, electricity and sanitation systems. So the point that I'm wanting to make is these are invisible infrastructures to the authorities. And sometimes they're platforms for innovation, for making life better, but often they come out of a politics of survival for people and communities, people that are deemed surplus by the state and capitalism. In Cape Town, in the Black Townships, we can see this failure of the state and capital to see the needs and the rights of mainly Black communities. And it's striking 30 years after the end of apartheid that race and class still determine who gets access to what kind of infrastructure. And in Cape Town, it's not the white or the middle class populations that are left with conditions of infrastructure inequality, but rather and predominantly the Black working class, in which their lives are often made invisible by the state and by the Democratic Alliance who run the city. What I found fascinating in a study I did in Cape Town with the Sescona's People Movement is, or the Poo protesters as they became known as Cape Town, is how through their political acts of spilling waste into the civic spaces of the city, they brought what Frantz Fanon called the stink of the old town to the decision makers, to the municipality. an act of dissent that at once made visible what is often invisible to the better off communities in Cape Town. But I don't just want to focus on the global south when we're trying to think about development and poverty and invisible infrastructures and the infrastructure gap. Here you can see an artistic installation by the artist Pope L, who stacks a load of boxes of plastic water up. And what he does here is bring to attention the need for an off-grid water supply in the city of Flint. To do so, he critiques the gross negligence of authorities, the poisoning of inner city communities in what is one of the richest countries in the world. And I think this is really important, that we talk about innovation, but we have to get the basics right. And who and what is made visible and invisible is perhaps important in thinking about these things here. So Flint is the most kind of visceral example in the US, and I think the global north, in thinking how challenges around infrastructure and development don't just pertain to what we've called the global south in the past. I want to finish on my last slide. A high-profile panel was convened at an Ivy League university. The debate was about challenges of infrastructure and development. I asked the panel, given there was a prominent UN Habitat official on it, whether the agency should be called into the US cities, given the breakdown of basic infrastructure in many cities, particularly in the inner city, and the challenges that we ascribe to the South as development practitioners have become more and more visible in global North contexts. There was a nervous laughter when I asked the question from the audience, and I looked around, and it felt like it was mainly from older white professors, because for them, these infrastructure struggles in Detroit, in Camden, New Jersey, in Flint are invisible to them. So in concluding, I want to draw attention to how we understand infrastructure, who views it, and how different populations are made invisible by the state and capital. And then finally, I want to challenge this idea of global north and south. One, to think about how so-called conditions of the south are increasingly visible in our global north cities, but two, to think about some of these ways in which these infrastructures from below and the popular economies that are brought about through them may kind of revitalize communities in the global north. And I hope in the question and answer section, we might talk a bit more about that. Thanks very much for your patience with my technology.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for such thought-provoking insight on invisible technologies, networks, and systems that has allowed various forms of urban circulation, and also importantly pointing out the power of people to make the invisible visible. And we are looking forward to the question and answer session on that round. So moving forward with our last speaker, we would like to welcome Geci.
Oh, first though, please do participate in our second poll as Geci prepares her presentation. This question is, who is responsible for creating positive infrastructures in the global south? Local authorities, national government, community members, or other? We look forward to collecting your thoughts here and discussing them shortly.
Come on, you can do better than that.
Our professor has kindly pointed out that more than 50% of you surely have an opinion on this matter. We encourage you to respond. And we will close the poll momentarily. Okay, we will end the poll now and hand the floor to Geci. Thank you so much for being our third panelist, and we look forward to what you have to say now. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for having me. And Luke pointed out earlier when I mentioned to him that we were scheduled to have load shedding in Johannesburg, the irony of speaking on invisibility while I'm sitting in the dark. But I hope I'm not entirely invisible to you, and I'm glad to be able to share with you anyway. So my name is Geci, and I'm going to try and share screen here and see whether it works. Does that look okay? It's okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, lovely. So thank you. And I'm actually really glad to be following from Michelle and Jonathan, because a lot of what they've shared resonates with me. And I think I'll be hopefully making some similar points in a slightly different way. I'm going to try to do the impossible, which is share double the number of slides and the amount of time I have. But fortunately, they're mostly pictures. So I hope they'll speak to you in some sort of way. And what I want to do is, I was so excited by the subject, and I thought of like 20 different ways to engage with it when it was initially introduced. And I thought what I would do is really just reflect from my perspective in the Global South around what forms of adopt. So I don't know if recording is back. Okay. How so? This invisibility, visibility from a few vantages. And I could have probably given 30 other vantages. I'll give you 7 in the amount of time we have. So what's hidden in the first place? And let's see if this progresses. It's now being, oops, no, what happened? Let's see if it's back. Can you still see, I hope? Okay, so what's hidden? I wanted to share this first sort of collage of photos from a project I was involved in called Seams, and it was about hidden things, if you want to call it, hidden cities within the city of Johannesburg. And what we tried to do with this study in 2019, 2020 was to confront the invisibility, the blame, the victimization, the exclusion, the occlusion of communities in what we themed what called the constructed margins of society. And to really ask this question, how exactly do our cities and their infrastructures actively produce and reproduce this inversion of who is and who isn't the city, these active forms of exclusion? And whether it was issues like informal livelihoods or sex workers or religion or LGBTQ fugitive ways in the city, forms of hospitality in the city. All of these reflect different layers of physicality, of politics, of economics, of social issues, of spatial issues, of cultural marginality. And these were some of what we were asking. So what do you see here? Who are the hidden people in the city? And what is the role of infrastructure in not just staging that, but in enabling that? So that's just one vantage. Let me give you a second vantage. Remember, we've got 18 slides in 9 minutes. The second one is really around hidden ways. And I show this to speak to my own experience, where in 2010, I remember having active arguments with people in South Africa around what you see here and what was then termed backyard shacks, and having many officials speak to the illegality of these structures and the need to eradicate them, because it was pretty much illegal for a person who had a public house, what we call an RDP house or a Mandela house, and puts up an extra structure. This was considered to really be a violation of the law and to be unregulated and to be unhygienic, et cetera, and to be stealing electricity and blah, blah, blah. Fast forward to 10 years later, where the very same system begins to see this as an actual housing economy, as something that is not just a good idea, but in fact something the state actively ought to be supporting, because there is no point of housing somebody who has no form of livelihood and who has no determination about what to do with their own property that you claim to be affording to them. So what was invisible then to these officials, where the story can change? And there are many examples of this. This applies to home-based industries. It applies to public space trading, to other innovative uses of space, this active criminalization, if you want, of what people try to do with space, and the infrastructures that they create for themselves. And so there are many different examples. The Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation has done a number of case studies actually on the urban design potentials of some of these approaches. What about hidden distance? And here I give you 2 case studies of 2 different places where I've lived. So lived in LA, where it was really to my horror working with young kids in Vernon Central a number of years ago to find out that many of them had never seen the ocean, which was literally 17 miles away. Not that different from my experience recently, where I live pretty much in this sort of Santon area and Alexandra Township, which is literally 4 miles away. I would work with young girls who had never actually entered the big shopping mall that's 4 miles away. So what does it speak to in terms of hidden barriers, hidden fences, hidden walls that make places closed off, even if there's nothing physically keeping you from there, or doesn't seem to be anything physically keeping you from there? In fact, we've got a huge bridge that's been built. But I had kids in Vernon Central telling me that, in a way, it was easier for them to imagine being in outer space than to imagine being at the beach 17 miles away. So what's that about? I wanted to talk about hidden belongings. So a good friend of mine, Melissa Miambo, whose work I really appreciate, talks about the hipsterification of places. And these things get uncomfortable, but what does it mean, whether it's in Delhi or Johannesburg or Los Angeles for that matter, or I don't know, I've never been to Arizona. Luke says he'll invite me sometime. But what does it mean for us to have spaces that change, and do we notice who's not there? And do we wonder about, again, what infrastructures, seemingly benign, probably positive, also perhaps have implications? And does that matter? Does it matter who belongs and who doesn't? What about hidden reproduction? So what is it that causes? So South Africa had this infamous Time magazine cover about being the most unequal country in the world. But in fact, and I wish I could find the slide that a colleague of mine, Indra Delanerol, shows, where he basically shows that the digital infrastructure we've been laying out for the past decade essentially mirrors the physical infrastructure we'd laid out during apartheid. And so whereas my neighborhood has fantastic Vumatel fiber that allows me to stay online even in the dark, across the highway from me, that's an impossibility. And what does it mean when we see statistics that tell us clearly that there's a very racial profile to who has access and who doesn't? And so when we say that, oh, we've survived COVID and we can actually just virtualize and go online, who are we talking about and who is not part of that statistic? What are we reproducing? What about hidden safety? And so here it's just a short story. I'm on number 6, don't worry, we'll get to the last ones. I was part of an initiative speaking on urban safety, and safety is a very big issue in South Africa. And we were sort of monitoring the statistics and really trying to look at what was getting better, what was getting worse. What was interesting is when we found that the burglary figures were going down, but the robbery figures were going up. And it actually took us a while to notice this. And what, of course, came out of this was that as people, and securitization is a very big thing in South Africa, private security, putting up alarm systems, walls and fences, almost everybody has private security and sensors and all of this stuff. Actually, my husband's been, well, he's here, so let me not speak too loudly. He's been busy doing the same thing around here. And what the study found is that the reason the robberies were going up is because you may recognize the difference between the two is whether force and the involvement of the actual victim, whether the victim has to be there. So whether there's the threat of violence in order to rob you became necessary, because it was now necessary for you to, in fact, encounter the homeowner or somebody going into the property in order for you to gain access. So when we thought we were creating safety, what we were creating, in fact, was a much higher likelihood of bodily harm, because you now had to be brought into the act of theft. So were we really dealing with a problem, or are we just trying to shut it out? And then never mind that even in this slide, I'm not even talking about the other levels of unsafety, the domestic violence that's gone up during COVID, the gender-based violence, the racial violence that happens behind those walls and in these communities that, again, isn't often part of even the statistics we talk about at this level of policing when we talk about urban safety. So what's hidden there in our definitions of safety? And I wanted to round up these vantages with, what about planners? Because when we talk about all of these issues, who are the hidden engineers, the hidden planners, the hidden architects that we don't even talk about when we talk about infrastructures, and what does it mean to possibly bring them in? So here I'm just sharing some quick slides from a project I was part of through Cities Network to talk about, and we call these the visualization studios. What would it look like to actually involve communities and give them the tools and help them visualize in various creative ways and actually think about what their communities might be? There's nothing new about this. I think many people try to do it, but I don't know that we ever actually institutionalize it. And so here, in very short summary, is how people actually came up with really actively different frames, really powerful reimaginings of what their cities could be and what could inform those different starting points from any planner or architect that I've seen, and I'm among those planners and architects. So what does it mean to possibly galvanize actors and actions, and why do we not do that? Why do we not see them as part of who could contribute professionally? So having said that's all invisible, and those, like I said, are 7 out of 70 I could have given you. What is visible, in fact? Well, I just did a quick Google search. Apparently, this is visible. So this is what the perfect city should look like. And I love the name of the website, actually, that produced it. It's called Love Money. This is the perfect city with lots of visible infrastructure. And you might also notice lots of invisible people. I don't know if you can see them at all. What I also see is invisible here is invisible alternatives to this, invisible culture, invisible history, invisible place or location. There's nothing specific about this. Who pays, who benefits, where am I in these renderings? And these renderings are all over South Africa. These renderings are all over Africa. These renderings are all over the world as the image of the perfect city. Why is this visible? Let's talk about what's possible, and I'm going to try and wrap up here because I'm sure I'm running out of time, even though I didn't actually check my watch. So this is a project that I've been playing with a colleague of mine, Tiresh Govender, who's an architect and urban designer here. And what we were asking, so what you see here to the left are some of the typical smart city images that are fairly similar to that perfect city you just saw, except these are real renderings for a project that's ongoing about 20 kilometers from where I live. And next to them are probably, in my view, more accurate reflections of how many people experience and use the city. They put up temporary infrastructures to have events, and that's okay. I think it's actually a wonderful thing to do. This is an example from Durban of a Muti market. In Joburg, we don't have anything that formal. Muti is traditional medicine here, and many people use traditional medicine. But many of our cities don't accommodate it at all. And so it's really invisible in most places. And this is one of the scenes I love seeing around Johannesburg. It's worshippers around water. So many people go to places where it's green and there are waterways to worship and pray, and you'll see them many times on weekends. Again, invisible to most of the city, and of course, completely invisible from this kind of rendering. And what we began to play with is what would it look like to swap, and I won't go into explaining this image because it's too complicated, but I assure you it's fun, and read the article when it's out. It will be out shortly. What would it look like to, in a way, create, sort of undo the narrative, change the narrative from what you see here, the smart city narrative, to something different? What would it look to expand the narrative and bring in the occluded? And that's what we began to play with. And I'll just share with you quickly here some images of what we ended up with. We talked about different conditions of the city and different modes in which people interact and what different futures might look like. So we had what we called room for contest, and that's really just talking about what it looks like to have these fights around habitat across different levels of voice, and what a different city might look like, what the windows might look like from something like that. This seems very abstract, and I'm sure it is because I'm not explaining it, but I assure you the article doesn't explain it either. It sort of forces you to look at it and engage with what this might mean. We then played with what we call terrain manipulations, and this was a sort of a riff off of some of the work of people like Robert Neuwirth, who talks about shadow cities, and other work we've seen. So if you just imagine that we have these layers of city, what's visible and then what's not, in many different ways. If you think about what's not visible, what would it look like to actually peel those and let them interact in different ways? Could we actually imagine a different kind of city, and how interesting would that be? And then finally, the third one we looked at was in terms of leisure and how we use the city, and what it might look like to actually play. We called it sort of streets of desire or desired. And it was really about beginning to understand that cities, the temporality as well to cities, that in fact, space can do different things over time. And yet we prefer to just lock up things and turn off the lights and assume things can only be one thing. Places can only be one thing in a week, in a year, in the hours of a day. Why do we do that? So why can't we see time differently, which might create a very different city? So these are some of the things we were doing. This is a rendering that I love by sort of architect, futurist Olalekan Jefus from Nigeria. And what I like about this kind of speculative, I guess we'd call it art, but I think it's more than just art, is that it's not presented to be desirable or undesirable. It's presented to really force us to think about what's there and not these crazy perfect city imaginings that we have that have absolutely nothing to do with the city that's there now. And so maybe just to conclude, so what? These are the three things I think we need to do, that I think people who are thinking about infrastructure and involved in it, and in a way, I think it picks up on some of the things I heard both of the previous speakers mention. We need to imagine things differently. And I think that goes to for any professional, any innovator, but also any community. We've got to imagine different cities and radically different and radically soon, I hope. Secondly, we need to do things differently. Absolutely, yes, on the co-production and on understanding that many of the technologies, including the civic tech that I'm very actively part of, allows many more people to be active players in developing the city and in developing the infrastructures. And finally, we then have to institutionalize. There's no point of fluffing around the edges, coming up with nice, cute ideas that never actually gain traction and become a better way of doing. And that really does speak to the institutional issues, I think, that the second speaker also mentioned. And I'm going to stop there. Apologies for going over, but I hope the pictures were fun at least. Thank you.
Geci, thank you very, very much to all three panelists. And as we transition into our Q&A audience, you will see our third and final poll on your screen shortly. Is it only when invisible communities, people, enforce their visibility that they are recognized by state actors? Yes, no, sometimes, or unsure? And we'll give you a moment to digest that last question, and then we will go into our Q&A. So as soon as you've answered the poll, please do drop any of your questions into the Q&A box inside of Zoom, and we will discuss the poll outcomes as well as your questions shortly. Okay, last call, and we will close the poll.
Looks like a few who never read the question, right?
We've got 16 responses and 26 online.
Yeah.
All right. There we go.
Okay.
All right, we have a little over half an hour left to discuss, so I'd love to jump in to first, the very first poll question.
You close that poll, right?
Yes. One out. Which, if you recall, was asked to our first presenter, Michelle, or after her presentation, what role do business and markets play in innovating in global development? A central role, a peripheral role, or a minimal role? And panelists, the majority of our respondents said it plays a central role. Do any of you three have a strong opinion on that off the bat that you'd like to discuss?
Well, seeing as how I was the instigator of that question, I will go ahead and react to it. Can you tell me what the percentage was on the central?
Yes,
What were
so
the percentages?
58% of the audience answered central, 32 answered peripheral, and 11% answered minimal.
11, okay. Okay, here is maybe a deeper dive into some of my earlier comments that may also be getting at the poll results. I am referring to business and markets as an approach to innovation, not as an approach to development. And so what's happening is I think they are getting mixed up. And I think we're hearing a lot of advocacy now that business and markets are the intervention or are the solution that is going to lift a lot of the world's poorest out of poverty. My hypothesis is that is not the case. My goal from a consumer and a capitalistic standpoint is to have every human on the planet be a consumer, be able to participate in a market, be able to have the resources in order to participate in the business world as a driver of business, and they themselves potentially as an owner of a business or participating in the economy in a way that is suitable for them. Where I'm coming from is this kind of fascinating trend in the innovation space that business and markets are the answer to lifting people out of poverty. And so, for example, I'm seeing market-driven solutions applied in the health space. I'm seeing market-driven solutions applied in the democracy and governance space and in the natural resource management space. And I question whether or not capitalism and markets can actually positively affect change in all those spaces. So do I want everyone on the planet to be a consumer and to engage in markets? Yes. I think trying to lift the world's poorest and most marginalized into the space of being an active participant in a market, I don't think that business and markets are going to get them out of where they're at and into being an active consumer or an active participant in the market. So I'm referring to business and markets as an approach to innovation. I do think that we should consider all people aspirationally as a part of the market, but I don't think that business and markets, I don't think we have the data to yet say that business and markets are going to elevate people out of poverty. To the world's most marginalized and the world's poorest, I really question whether or not that is going to be how we necessarily get there. Geci, I'm not going to lie, I'm quite curious to hear your thoughts on that one. Can I put you on the spot and ask?
If you didn't, I was going to. Geci, please give us your thoughts on this same question, and of course, Michelle's response.
So I, of course, agree with Michelle. And it's like, on that last slide when I talked about different processes, one of the organizations I do quite a bit of work with, it's been interesting to see the reaction to speaking to corporate actors, to how they understand the process of innovation and who does it. And so when Michelle talks about earlier in her talk, the co-production and this disconnect with end users, and then this idea that innovation is something that's done for people, let's even broaden it, development is something that's done for people. That's, I think, a fairly characteristic feature, just as an example of corporate approaches, but in my view, simply doesn't work. And so when I used to say to them that, well, you're not going to be sort of, three clever white males in a room planning for the rest of the world while they do what. And this was often quite provocative because for many of them, they just kind of assumed that that's what the issue was. So yeah, I would agree. I wouldn't see this as the approach.
On that note, we would like to bring in Jonathan. Jonathan talks about the interplay between the invisible infrastructure through activism and informal infrastructure. What do you believe are the best mechanisms for excluded population to leverage their invisible infrastructure to assert their visibility in the city?
Yeah, I mean, building on the previous question as well, if we take the corporation and think about the longer histories of the Western corporation in African cities, I think it makes us rethink what innovation is, so that it actually becomes a form of extraction. And here I'm thinking about the entry of Uber into South Africa or Uganda, where what's seen as an innovation in the transport infrastructure really becomes a new form of extraction. You can see that in the daily lives of taxi drivers whose margins become even thinner when they're forced to give to Uber some of their fees. And you can see that a lot of technology is not actually aimed at social good, but is aimed at creating more profit for the corporations. So what is an alternative to that is to think through this idea of popular economy that is both focused on the state delivering services, but also diversifying ownership over infrastructure. So we need to move away from capitalist ownership and operation of infrastructure, but we also need to devolve that ownership away from the state to different scales. So municipalities, communities, and particular neighborhoods, and begin to think about who owns those innovations, how they're operated, and what kind of livelihoods they open up, as the question, or at least that's what I think.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And one last question on that talk. So this is for the entire panel, referring to program development. Is it possible to have a balance between accountability in terms of money spent and accountability in terms of program effectiveness for meeting the end user's need?
Can you say that one more time?
Okay, referring to the program development, is it possible to have a balance between accountability in terms of money spent and accountability in terms of program effectiveness to meet the end user's need? Where's the balance?
Is it possible to balance accountability in money and accountability in outcomes?
Can I make a comment on this one? Just because I was part of a project recently that was quite funny. Well, it wasn't that funny, actually. So the Women's Refugee Council did a global study, and it was quite a complex sort of qualitative method in asking women and displaced people all over the world to answer some questions. And in one of the dimensions of this, where they were asked to rank what was most important, the issue, to use your language, of accountability and transparency around governance and resources was ranked higher than whether the intervention actually achieved anything. And I picked this up and I thought it was very curious, and it led to quite a big discussion around this. And what we concluded is that it's something that's been driven by institutions that have somehow convinced people that because governance issues are of course important, they're somehow more important than whether the outcomes were achieved and whether the beneficiaries benefited at all from what was done, as long as you can account for the money. Now, I'm not for a lack of accountability for resources. That's obviously very important. But I do think we've somehow got things upside down here. And I do worry that sometimes some of the hygiene factors we introduce into programs, especially in the humanitarian space, I think take over. And I don't know if it's just philanthropies that do that or if it happens in other sectors. But this was very distinct in this project. I think it is possible. But I think the possibility of it has to come from allowing some common sense to prevail around what it is we're actually trying to do here.
I'll add a story to that as well, if I may, because I feel like this story is quintessentially answering this question. About 5 years ago, I was asked to go down to Colombia to do a human-centered design exercise with Afro-Colombian and Indigenous women around economic empowerment, because PACT was going to bid on a $65 million proposal to empower Afro-Colombian and Indigenous persons. And one of the 3 objectives in the proposal was economic empowerment of women. So they wanted to go down and do a design thinking exercise to understand the underlying drivers and incentives of decision-making for women, so as to make the program more needs-oriented, more demand-driven, and seemingly to benefit the needs of the end user, which is getting to your question. So we went down to Colombia, me and a design team. We all but lived in the communities for several weeks, and we worked with 5 different Afro-Colombian Indigenous populations across the Northeast. And what came out of our design exercise was that even though intellectually the women wanted economic empowerment opportunities because they wanted access to finance and they knew it was going to benefit themselves and their families, emotionally, they had been so traumatized by the conflict with the FARC and the ELN that emotionally there was too much fear involved around their perception of micro enterprises and economic empowerment, that they, even though they wanted the activities, they didn't want them to be successful, and they wanted them to stay under the radar, because PACT is very famous for helping build micro enterprises. So women on the side of the road selling fruit and selling baskets. And in these women's mind, that means that they are by themselves on the side of the road, and a member of the FARC or the ELN is going to come up and rob them, and potentially rape them, and then completely destabilize the security of their village. And so the outcome of the design thinking exercise is me going back to my national headquarters saying, we need to completely rethink our approach to women's empowerment. I don't care that this is PAC's bread and butter. This is not what they want. Like, we're making them nervous and scared by offering this as our solution. Okay, so big moment, big existential moment at PAC. Like, what are we gonna do? Here's 65 million from the donor. Here's what the user is saying they want. They don't line up. We still went after the proposal, and it was on my team to come up with a way to work around that fear of being out on the road alone, setting up your own micro enterprise. And what we ended up doing was we ended up pulling in SENA, which is the Colombian government institution that runs their vocational training. And by attaching SENA to our activities, it made it feel more institutional to the women. And it felt like there was a layer of protection on top of the economic empowerment, even though in reality, it really wasn't there, but it felt like it was there. It was a positive invisible infrastructure that was layered onto the intervention that we got out of the design thinking exercise. But I have to tell you, at the end of the day, it was quite a moment at PAC where it was like, well, this is what the user's saying they need. Here's 65 million on the table. What are you going to do? And basically they kind of went for both. You know, they weren't willing to take the proposal off the table. They weren't willing to say, you know, I think this goes against the ethos of our accountability to our end user. Like, let's go for something else. So, you know, I think to Geci's point about, you know, whether or not you stay accountable to the institution, those institutions are really powerful. They're very, very powerful. And until they really change, and I give them credit, I know they're trying, or at least I know that there's more dialogue coming out of them. But they do continue to be an enormous underlying driver of the invisible infrastructures that operate within development.
And thank you both so much for those comments. And it leads into our next poll. And I'll start by asking Jonathan for his thoughts here. And they are related to this conversation. The poll question following your presentation was, who is responsible for creating positive infrastructures in the Global South? And the majority of our audience, 39%, responded local authorities. Oh, there are the results on your screen as well. And second highest was national government, followed by community members, and then other. How would you yourself answer this poll? And how do you think that this fits into the greater discussion we're having here?
Yeah, well, I think there was a category missing there, and that would be the what are called the donor community at the moment, or the global north. Because if we think through something like climate change, the impacts being felt by communities, the need for low carbon technologies, how national governments in places like Uganda could finance these, it's not clear. And in Uganda, there's a massive drive towards decentralization. So you have all the kind of responsibility towards local authorities. Now, of course, they should be driving the innovation at the local level. But what you have is that the finance is held by institutions such as the World Bank. So it's their responsibility, but it's not working through the mechanisms that they've been practicing for the last 70 years. So thinking through climate change and thinking through issues like climate debt, then I think the responsibility for delivering these kind of infrastructures lay in the historic underdevelopment of Africa through the global north and its enrichment, both in colonial era, but also in the post-colonial era, the domination of the World Bank and the IMF, and the effects of structural adjustment. So there has to be a reckoning. You can't say this is a responsibility of a national government or a local authority if they're not given the finance to do it. And for the last 70 years, that's been a form of loan-based finance, which has come with conditionalities. So the answer is local authorities, but actually in order to enable that to happen, we've really got to rethink the global architectures of development finance.
Thank you very much. And we'll lead right into one of the questions related to this from our Q&A. And this is for the whole panel, but let's start with Jonathan.
Something that has been felt is that something that has been less discussed in the talk is the invisible infrastructure within governments through various power dynamics, procurement policies, and institutional structures, and how they may inhibit the inclusion of invisible population. Can anyone comment on that role of invisible infrastructure within states and how that can better respond to the invisible community and people? So we'll start
Very,
with
very
Jonathan.
related to what you were just discussing, I
Yeah.
guess, more around invisible people. Could you first comment, and then, of course, the rest of the panel?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting to talk a bit more about South Africa, which has, over the last 30 years, delivered a huge amount of infrastructure for some of the poorest in the country, talking millions of housing units and electricity connections. And yet there's still millions of people living in conditions that they never dreamed they would have to live through after the end of apartheid. And you know, the ANC-led government, and I look forward to hearing from Geci more about this, has driven a really innovative infrastructural and housing program, first through the RDP, but it's been restrained by the political economy in which it's worked through. So particularly the introduction of gear in the early 2000s, forms of privatization, and the kind of market logics that are structured into a government. And this isn't just like a South African problem. In the UK, we've had a decade of austerity. So the power to shape investment trajectories is very much about political ideology. It's about a political economy. It's about this word that is horrible to use as an academic, but I will, of neoliberalism, of the market can deliver. But I think, you know, it hasn't delivered. And you know, we can come up with all these whizzy, innovative programs, we can come up with new plans, but what we end up with is that markets serve the rich and they're not that interested in the poor, as Michelle's pointed out, right? So in somewhere like Accra, you see these amazing new cities being designed, but they're gated, right? If you've got the money, you can access the technology. Meanwhile, the rest of the city's being left and its infrastructure is decaying. So this is very much about invisibility. And I think one of the roles of social scientists in particular is to try and make visible some of these power structures at work, the kind of political economies of particular governments, but also these longer histories in which we think about the center and the periphery in the global economy.
So can I push back on that a little bit?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So fundamentally, Jonathan, I do agree with you, and I'm being a little facetious here. However, I actually don't think that when it comes to the broad global government aspect, that it is invisible. Because if we look back at Bretton Woods, so if we're taking it back to World War II and we're talking about post-World War II reconstruction, we are talking about reconstruction of the previous colony states and wanting to bring them into the developed world through a period of industrialization. So we have the creation of the IMF and the World Bank. And then by the 1980s, we have those same previously colonized nations completely indebted to the West through this process of reconstruction. And then you're looking at the debt restructuring and debt that these countries can't even get out of today. So I'm being a little bit facetious, but I actually think from that like global government standpoint, you could trace it all the way back to World War II. But I'd like to go one step further into what you were saying, Jonathan, about the rich not caring. I have to share a metric with you all that I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but there was a US-based study between GFI, which is a global financial integrity company, and the Center for Applied Research at the Norwegian School of Economics. And what they did was they tallied up all the financial resources that get transferred between rich countries and poor countries each year. And that's not just aid and foreign investment and trade flows, but it's also non-financial transfers like debt cancellation, unrecorded transfer from worker remittances, and unrecorded capital flight. And 2020 was the last year of recorded data. And developing countries received a total of $1.3 trillion, including all aid, investment, and income from abroad. But the same year, 3.3 trillion flowed out of those countries. And so in other words, developing countries sent 2 trillion more to the rest of the world than they received. So in other words, for every dollar of aid that developing countries receive, they lose $24 in net outflows. So I am more than happy to drop that research into the chat if you're interested in looking at it, but there are some really strong systems in place right now that are just entrenched for decades, that are making people a lot of money. And I don't mean to kind of call out or disparage everyone as not having positive intentions, but I do think it kind of goes back to some of what I was saying before, which is do more good isn't the same thing as do less harm. And I think the do less harm piece is the harder part of that cognitive dissonance to try to reconcile. And even when you've got government systems that are set up to be extractive of developed countries, I mean, it's quite a system to unravel. And just quickly, I saw a question come in from a member of the audience that was talking about, why am I saying that I want people to be consumers, not producers? It's because my interpretation of what has happened in the global South in lean economies is purely extractive. I don't like the idea of wanting more production out of the global South. I like the idea of the global South having the agency and the freedom and flexibility and autonomy to have the choice to consume. And so it's not that I'm not thinking that people in the global South won't be entrepreneurs or won't have their own businesses or won't be successful. It's that we have a very extractive history. I guess I'm saying we, as me sitting here in DC, you know, in the West, and I want to flip that extractive narrative into seeing the global South as being consumers with the agency and the choice and the financial ability to engage on equal footing from a market standpoint. So I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes
Well, as we give Geci and Jonathan, of course, an opportunity to respond and chime in on those same ideas, I just want to mention that in the Q&A, we have a lot of questions about how do we reach the end user and how can the end user make themselves visible who are being made invisible at the moment. So as you continue to discuss this topic, I think our audience would be very interested in any innovations that you think we could implement to ensure that services and dollars or what have you get to that end user, or sometimes we say intended beneficiary. Maybe I'll pass it to Geci first.
So I think one of the ways to do that is this point about just doing things differently. So having processes that are themselves more inclusive. I like to say that inclusion isn't something you do at the end. It's not a goal. Inclusion has to be a process. You're not going to include people by doing something that excludes them, and then somehow inclusion is the outcome. Things don't, if you think about it, don't really work that way. And I think there are some people doing really interesting work around some aspects of human-centered design, human-centered development, co-production. Unfortunately, I think we're still using the words more than we are actually doing the deed. But I do think that there has to be this evolution of practice to itself being more inclusive. Otherwise, I don't really see how, and I think Michelle made the point nicely earlier, I think there is a tendency to reproduce and to continue reinforcing existing power structures if you fail to bring in anybody else. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. And I think the points that are made by the speakers right now around this global economy piece as well, I think it's really important. And I'll give you a small example, and I like the one Michelle just gave about the, you know, the flows of money and in what direction are things going. Even at a local level, I saw in South Africa a number of years ago, I was involved with a really major development program that in our government's opinion was an impressive scale with a 10-year timeline. And so it sounded big. Well, it sounded big until you compared it to what our Industrial Development Corporation was doing to fund big business, to in a way almost cause the problem we were then trying to fix through this developmental program. And so I think it's really, really important that we really understand it doesn't make sense to have one tiny hand that's giving frosting and icing and decoration, while one big ass hand is busy just, clapping everybody. And I'm kind of hopeful, and this is a strange thing for me to say because I do get a little bit tired, and I'm sorry to say because it's a bit rude. I do get a bit tired of the climate debates that seem to exclude everything else. But I do think what's really positive, perhaps out of the focus on climate change and the green agenda, is that perhaps it begins to get people to understand that it's not okay to cause a problem and then offer frosting. You've actually got to stop causing the problem. And so I think to Michelle's point about perhaps doing less harm being important, I think that's really important. But yeah, on the point about the end user, you bring in the end user by bringing in the end user. That's how you do it.
And I'm going to throw one more wrench in things here, as you are still welcome to jump in, but we're coming to the end of time, is that third poll question, which was similar to this. We asked, is it only when invisible communities or people enforce their visibility that they're recognized by state actors? And it was very close between yes and sometimes and not sure. So that's kind of the flip side. Geci, you're saying, well, you include them by including them. What about the flip side? And maybe Jonathan can start on this because you discussed, I believe you said poo protests. Yeah. What do you think? How would you answer this question? And how would you respond to an audience that is split in this way?
Well, I think Cape Town's a great example of two different approaches. One is a very unequal city, and for a lot of communities, mainly predominantly Black working class, they have really bad communal toilet facilities that are not well maintained by the local state. And it reached boiling point about 5 years ago. And what you saw was the poo protesters, the Sescona People's Movement, bringing the conditions that they had to live in to the city. So the airport, the town hall, and it made headlines, and a lot of people felt very uncomfortable about it. But what it did do is it made people talk about these atrocious toilet conditions, right? So sometimes this more kind of contesting and politicized movement can be really important to make visible these issues. Simultaneously, an NGO and a people's movement, the NGO is called Nidafuna, is a technical support organization for the Social Justice Coalition, developed an app that people could use on their phones to report when their toilets broke, so that the municipality would improve their maintenance and repair regimes. But because it was so highly politicized, this issue, the municipality ignored that innovation. Even though it would have made their operations better, there was so much kind of anger between the Social Justice Coalition and the council, the municipality, that the municipality didn't want to use it. So it's difficult, right? How you make visible. Sometimes it has to be in collaboration with the state. Sometimes it has to be in contestation. Sometimes you've just got to ignore the state entirely, I guess, and find other ways. So to go back to that question of how you engage end users, don't go and work for the World Bank as development practitioners. Go and work for the technical support organizations that are developing these kind of on-the-ground solutions, but be prepared for the state to ignore that and be open to these more politicized and kind of what are seen as angry movements, pushing issues forward in ways that perhaps NGOs can't.
Thank you so much. I think that we could discuss this for another 6 hours if we had the time, but we are in our last 5 minutes. So if each of you could just share your final brief thoughts on this question that we received, and we'll close from there. How, seeing as you each have different perspectives and backgrounds, Could you each connect the concepts of innovation, infrastructure, and development, and which is the primary driver of positive social change from your point of view? Let's start with Michelle, who's our first.
All right, I'm still kind of reflecting on my answer to that one, but I will start with this. My answer to the connection of those three is a fourth piece that's not in the answer, which is people. What I heard named in the question was institutions and approaches and kind of like mechanisms that people have constructed. And ultimately, I think we are dealing with a people-oriented problem here. The question of poverty is so tied into religious beliefs, ethnic beliefs, politics, history, land demarcations, like all problems that human beings ultimately created, and therefore the connection or the interconnection between innovation, infrastructure, and development. To me, the common denominator is people. And if I go one step further into unpacking that, and this also kind of answers the previous topic we were talking about, I think we have got to retrain the generation of people that want to help solve problems. I think we need to train them with mindsets towards humility, towards curiosity, towards empathy, that we do not have the answers, that particularly for those of us in the West, that we are not close to the problems. And if you want to help, your help is valued, but it's valued in the right way, and that you need to come to the table in the right way. And a lot of times when I bring it back to the innovation space, I hire people who are humble, empathetic, multidisciplinary problem solvers. And I want people who are not trained technical experts, and kind of like Jonathan said with the World Bank, I don't want people who are consultants or have lots of experience or come from large consulting agencies or government. I want the people who are so excited to solve a problem and so passionate about it and are willing to admit they don't know how to solve it and are ready to do whatever it takes to get there. So people is the answer, and training people differently is how we get there.
Thank you. Jonathan, as a second presenter, your 2 cents on this final question about the connection between these and which one drives social change.
And also we would love to relate the global South and the global North perspective in terms of inequality through the invisible infrastructure dimension.
Easy question for a 1 minute answer, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, most of that I could just say what Michelle said, right? I mean, really brilliant. What I would add is I'm an infrastructure scholar. So for me, we can think about how infrastructure is peopled, and we can think about infrastructures of solidarity across global North and South. You know, the struggle for poverty and equality and not something centered on the global South. And there's some really great movements that cross these geographical boundaries that bring inspiration and dialogue across diverse communities. You can look at the anti-eviction housing campaigns that began in Cape Town and shifted to Chicago. And you can think about how we as practitioners, development people, academics can in a way become infrastructures ourselves to help pass those messages along and bring connections together. In my home city of Manchester, I have a friend. She has set up local women's saving groups. It's inspired by the slum dweller model. She's brought women over from Nairobi, and it's beginning to transform lives here. But there's also all kinds of learning going on through these kind of interesting encounters. So
Thank you very much. And Geci, your final thoughts here around these connections, how we look at global South and global North, and what is the key driver for social change. Please share your thoughts as we close here.
So I can also say ditto, completely agree with both Jonathan and Michelle. I think what I would add is, I do think we have to learn how to distinguish between means and ends. For me, infrastructure is never the end. Even innovation, it's sort of a way of doing things. It's not necessarily what we are trying to be. So that leaves development, but that's a really troubling one. So we can spend a few days talking about what that actually means. And so I think what's really important is that context matters. Context matters, and you've got to really be clear on the why. And I'm amazed at how many times and how often I'm in conversations where we're busy discussing how to do something and what to do when we're not even clear why we are doing it and really what the bigger objective is here and how we are sure to attain that. So I think I would say, and I really do always insist these days on focusing on context and why we're doing things. We have to be purposeful, otherwise we can waste a lot of time. I just want to sneak in one other little comment. On the point earlier, the last poll, there's a really great article that Carl van Holt from South Africa wrote called "The Smoke That Falls." And that's just a caution about this idea that we really have to insist on the attention only through fighting for it. I think Jonathan made an excellent point about this, because it can result in a situation where, in a way, fighting becomes what we force communities to have to do to get what they shouldn't have to fight for. And so, yeah, I think, again, just needing some reframe around what we're actually trying to achieve and the why. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thank you very much. And
we have lots of questions which we sadly cannot get the answers to in this session. So we would like to call upon the end of the session, and we thank you all for your presentation. And
we will get this recording to everyone who has signed up, and maybe some of these resources and where you can connect further with our panelists. Thank you so much, panelists, on behalf of my entire cohort, and thank you, audience, for tuning in.
Thank you.